Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Salt Lake Chamber's webinar celebrating International Women's History Month, but focusing on the Women Lawyers of Utah recent report on the retention and advancement of women in the practice of law in Utah. We're really excited for this webinar today, not because the content of the webinar is particularly encouraging. To be candid, it's quite sobering, but because the data and actually having this data and people taking a look at it and using it the way that it is gives us a really great opportunity to make a real difference here in the state of Utah. We want to couch today's webinar under the theme of the International Women's Month this in 2021, which is choose to challenge. And I think one thing that we do here in the state of Utah well, and that our businesses here in Utah do well, is we are willing to accept challenges. And I think what we will learn from this report is we have challenges ahead of us and things that we can learn and lots of steps to take forward. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel here today. I will not do them justice with some short introductions, but presenting our report for us is Mica McKinney. Mica is the General Counsel for Utah State University. You can imagine that is a very large job, the university, and has been in the past year, but she's also taken a very active role in the Women Lawyers of Utah and oversaw this particular project. So very pleased that she's willing to present this report for us today. We also have with us Ashley Peck, who is a partner at Holland and Hart and is just the recent past president of the Women Lawyers of Utah. Also a fantastic individual who is dedicated so much to the practice of law and advancing women in that practice. And then we also are very honored to have with us Nate Alder, who is a partner at Christensen, Jensen in Salt Lake. Nate is a past president of the Utah Bar and has been very active in a number of issues. But the thing that I wanted to highlight for this report is Nate was the president of the bar when a similar report was done 10 years ago. And so I'm really excited to have Nate here with us to talk about the progress and maybe the lack of progress that we've seen, and again, what we should take away from some of that. So with that introduction, Mica, thank you so much for being willing to do this, and I'm going to turn the time over to you.
Still learning that Zoom trick of unmuting. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I'm going to share my screen, get this presentation queued up. I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk about the 2020, hold on one second, got a technical difficulty here. Can you all see, I assume you can chat if you don't see my screen here, the presentation, but I'm pleased to be here today to talk to you about the Women Lawyers of Utah's 2020 study on the barriers to advancement of women in the law. This report is part of an ongoing and long-standing initiative from the Women Lawyers of Utah that, as Jacey mentioned, started in 2010. In 2010, it was really a grassroots effort that started with a survey looking to collect information about the experience of women attorneys in Utah. And that survey revealed and illuminated some really challenging experiences for women lawyers and resulted in a number of initiatives that I'll highlight during this presentation. As Women Lawyers of Utah, we've worked to implement that. And as the year 2020 started to approach, we looked at a decade of work on the initiative and felt like it was really important to take another, test the temperature again and collect some more data about the experience of women attorneys in Utah and see if there's been any change in the experience of women attorneys. So in order to do this, we conducted a study. We contracted with Dr. Christy Glass at Utah State University, who's done a lot of work in this area, both on the legal profession, but also in the corporate sector, looking at various issues related to representation and barriers to advancement in various career tracks. The project was designed as a multi-method research approach. It had two components. First was a statewide survey of attorneys registered with Utah State Bar. The survey itself was designed to collect data that was comparable to the 2010 Women Lawyers of Utah survey, but also the National American Bar Association survey. We want to be able to compare both in-state experience, but also see how the experience of women attorneys in Utah measured up against the experience of women attorneys across the country. So we had a number of questions that were duplicative of those so that we could compare the data from 2010 and the ABA survey. So that was kind of the quantitative part, but it was also important for us to collect some qualitative data to get to speak with attorneys and get some more insight into the experience. So the research team conducted 47 in-depth interviews with women lawyers and judges across the state. And this is, I think, one of the richest parts of this, the 2020 report, is seeing how the experience of women as they describe it connects with the data that we saw. And it was really illuminating to connect those two issues. Taking this multi-method research approach, really what the study was trying to answer and identify barriers to advancement and the retention of women lawyers in the state of Utah. And the reason that's so important goes straight to the data regarding representation. Looking back again to the 2020 study, we knew, that study revealed that in 2010, 38% of students in law school were women. But as you move through their career track, that number significantly decreased, so that by the time attorneys reached the partner track, only 11% of partners in the state of Utah were women. So that 2010 study identified this, these barriers, and that women were not advancing. I often talk about that as a leak in the pipeline, that something was happening along the way where women were dropping out and not proceeding along that career track. Looking at the 2020 data, again, with the 2020 study collected data on this, we saw improvement in terms of law school graduates. The number of women law school graduates, or the percentage, increased to 40% at BYU and 53% at U of U, which is, I think, a very important increase. But unfortunately, we did not see any change in the actual career track. So the number of attorneys practicing that are women stayed stagnant. There was no change over a 10-year period. And then looking up the career, as you look through the career ladder, there was minimal to no improvement, only 1% change in terms of the number of partners who are women. That's, we found very discouraging, and something we'll want to talk, we'll talk about what some of the barriers we've identified may be for this, for women moving up the career track in the area of law. Compared nationally, we also wanted to just look and see how Utah's measuring up. Nationally, you'll see that our numbers, our percentages are lower. Nationally, there still is a discrepancy, and women are represented at a lower percentage. But compared to Utah is still lagging behind even those national numbers. One thing to note is that the experience of women attorneys is not unique. This lack of representation and leaking pipeline, as I've described it, occurs also in the corporate sector. This chart is something I took from the Women in the Workplace study that leanin.org and the McKinsey and Company have been conducting for a number of years. They update this information on an annual basis. And on looking more generally at women in the workplace, you continue to see this, underrepresentation of women, and particularly as you move up the career track. Notably, you can see for women of color, it's even more stark. So I think it's important to know, as we talk today about the experience of women attorneys, that there's a lot of parallel and overlap and shared experience with women more just generally in the workplace. So looking to the survey, we wanted to also see what's leading to that, and looking at one possible barrier is the experience of women in the workplace and some of the negative experiences they may have. The 2010 study looked at a number of issues, including harassment, unfair treatment, sex discrimination, and comparing the 2010 data to the 2020 data, we actually saw an increase in women's reporting these negative experiences. I guess one asterisk to this, we certainly recognize that over time, education and information about harassment and sex discrimination has increased. I think as a general society, we recognize these behaviors more, and I think identify them and label them as sex discrimination and harassment more readily. So we can't really say, looking at this data, what impact that had on the increased numbers. I think there's some more analysis that needs to be done. So we recognize that's a potential impact, but nonetheless, these experiences are on the increase. We did not see a reduction, and women are reporting really negative experiences in the workplace. The other thing to note is, as a result, I think, women were also reported being less optimistic about promotion, and that I think is a very concerning data point for us as we're looking to promote women up the career chain, and so we want to make sure that they're feeling optimistic about that. One thing to note, that the experience of workplace harassment occurred in all different work environments in terms for women attorneys. It was reported in government sector, in corporate counsel positions, as well as in nonprofit organizations. And you can see the increase is consistent across the board in all of these work environments. One of the things that I think is, the 2020 study identified and had a number of questions about, both on the quantitative side and the qualitative, was looking at the impact of workplace bias. You'll see that men, the survey was conducted across the bar, so women and men both participated in the survey. And across the board, women reported higher rates of experiencing different forms of bias in the workplace. So prove it again bias is the bias where women may be expected to prove themselves again and again. Their competence is not assumed, but rather treated often as a one-time occurrence. And so women and women of color often feel that they have to go above and beyond in order to establish their competence in a particular area. The tightrope bias, you'll see there's also a pretty significant difference between women and men. And that's the tightrope bias can be explained as that pressure to balance expectations. For women, it's trying to balance expectations of being feminine, and which sometimes is translated into being agreeable and supportive, and balancing that against kind of masculine expectations of being someone who can take charge of, sometimes we as attorneys feel like we have to be the aggressive bulldog attorney. And so women often find themselves walking a tightrope, trying to balance those expectations, and how those expectations are placed on them. Agency penalties are essentially just the penalty for not walking that tightrope balance. So penalties that occur when women are perceived as being overly aggressive or not fitting into the cultural norm. The other biases, I think, are some that are somewhat self-explanatory: parenthood penalties, the perception that individuals who have families are less committed to their positions, and then flexibility stigma is often associated with that, where individuals who request alternative work schedules or more flexibility perceive there's a stigma associated with that. Again, looking at this data, you can see that women feel like women are having a different experience in the workplace than men, and that appears to be contributing as a barrier to advancement in the law. But it's not all bad news, and I want to be very clear about that. We did see some really important areas of progress, and I think a lot of these issues are the direct result of the 2010 initiative. So let me walk through those, and then I'll talk about how that connects back to 2010. The first area of improvement is that the stigma associated with the use of flexible work arrangements is lower in Utah than nationally. So as we compared Utah's data to the ABA survey data, we saw that the bias and stigma associated with that was lower. And that suggests Utah may be more family friendly than other states. And that's something that applies across the board to both women and men. Second, the gender gap in reliance on flexible work arrangements has declined over time. In 2020, men and women were equally likely to desire alternative work schedules, so we're seeing more parity. And I think an overlapping theme, again, that Utah is more family friendly and the expectations of workplaces reflect that. The third area of progress was that in 2020, men and women were likely than in 2010 to see a long-term future in their current position. So this is an interesting data point compared to women feeling less optimistic about promotion, but also seeing some long-term future. And I think that one way to look at that is a commitment to their current position and an indication that they are planning to stay in their current role. So that indicates growing career support and stability among our lawyers in Utah. And then finally, women lawyers reported greater access to mentorship in 2020 than they did in 2010, suggesting growing support for women's careers. So it was really interesting to see the positive, with all of the negative data and issues of bias and harassment, that on the flip side, in terms of flexible work arrangements and supporting families, we saw some improvement. And I do think that's directly connected with the efforts of the 2010 study. One of the major initiatives that came out of the 2010 study was adopting flexible work arrangement policies, reduced hour policies at firms. Most law firms in Utah implemented those, and we're seeing the positive outcomes from that. And I think that's just one thing to keep in mind as many of us are trying to address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes it can feel daunting, and that it's hard to see how policies are having an impact. But the 2020 study, I think, showed in very clear ways the impact of diversity policies and policies that are supportive of women attorneys. The other thing I think that's really important to take away from this, and this is something that's been echoed by some of the messaging from the Women's Leadership Institute, and I'll just read this quote, is that ultimately empowering women is not just about women. As we empower women in their careers, it elevates everyone. It elevates men, and it elevates the entire communities. The positive data we saw of the 2020 study reflected that directly. We started to see more parity in terms of women and men opting for flexible career paths and pushing for more flexibility and parental support in their careers. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind as we look at policies and try and really increase our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, keeping in mind that these have beneficial impacts across the board and benefit all members of our communities. So with all of this negative data in mind, one of the key things we wanted to collect from the qualitative interviews was input from women attorneys themselves about what solutions they thought were available to address some of these things. As you collect data, it's not always, as you're looking at that, we often look to other resources rather than talking to the individuals directly impacted to find out what changes would help, what can change. And the 2020 study collected that. And here are some of the solutions that were identified by the respondents, particularly those 47 women who were interviewed. The first is cultural change. And these are kind of 5 broad themes. There were a number of solutions, but as we group them, there are 5 themes that kind of surfaced. The cultural change was talked about in a couple of different ways, but largely changing expectations, both internally of women, changing expectations as to what, opting for career paths. Many women indicated that young students, even as early as high school and elementary school, women should be encouraged to pursue career tracks. They should be, we should develop a cultural expectation that women will pursue these options and that they are a good fit for career options. It also a number of attorneys also talked about just more broadly cultural change in terms of expectation, both of women attorneys, but also of family dynamics. In many instances, a family will choose to have one primary caregiver, and many women express that they feel like the cultural expectation is that it'll always be the woman that opts for that, but creating and really advocated for changing that cultural norm where there's more variety in terms of cultural expectations, and including, men and others serving as a primary caregiver, and that women pursuing their career wouldn't be viewed negatively, wouldn't serve as an agency penalty essentially on them pursuing that, and as opposed to serving as a primary caregiver. The second is representation, and this is a theme I'm sure you saw in the data. Representation is so key to the advancement of women. It's, I think, key for 2 reasons. One, you've probably heard the saying, you can't be what you can't see. And this quote to the right, I think, really reflects that often for women to advance and to move forward up the career ladder, they really need to see themselves in that, someone like them in that position and have that role model. So representation is just really key to have in those leadership ranks, so that that's a goal that women will aspire to and really see as a realistic opportunity for them. Representation is also important though, because and this I think is really reflected in the McKinsey & Company study, if any of you've looked at that, just generally about women in the workplace, is that it's very difficult to be the one and only, to be the only woman around a board table, to be the only woman at a trial. And that can be isolating in a couple of ways. One, it really plays into that prove it again bias. If you're the only one, you often feel like you have to prove yourself over and over and go on above and beyond to not only prove yourself, but to prove the the competency of your gender, of your race, or those with similar identities. It also, underrepresentation also leads to feelings of tokenism, which is somewhat, has some overlap with proved against bias, but also individuals feeling like when you're the one and only, and there's not broad representation, that you're being included for reasons not associated with your competency or your success. So representation is so key. It's also key for decision making, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the best practices. The others are, I think, themes that you probably are all very familiar with. Mentoring and networking is incredibly important, not only for personal development, but also business development. For attorneys, building a book of business really is the key, particularly for those in a private practice. Being able to move up to the partnership track requires you to have a book of business. And so having that network for that is incredibly important. But mentoring is also, and networking is also incredibly important for building those intangible skills. In many career tracks, and attorneys, certainly fit this bill, that there's the formal training that law school and some other training provides, but then there's a lot of training and personal skill development that happens through an apprenticeship, that occurs when you work directly with someone or are mentored by someone who can kind of show you the ropes. And it's really hard to develop those intangible skills without that mentoring relationship. So mentoring and networking is incredibly important for the advancement of women in both the law as well as just corporate tracks generally. I talked a little bit about diversity policies. Having formal policies is really important to make sure that we're not all slipping into our own implicit biases, and that we have formal policies that really direct the way that we carry out our business. And then parental supports, again, looking back at some of the success from the 2020 study, having parental support so that individuals can focus on their career allows us to develop and move up the career ladder. So looking one of the things that was really important to the women lawyers of Utah as we looked at the 2020 study, and we're thinking about what we wanted the 2020 study to look like and include, and it was really important to us that we developed some best practices and provided some guidance for the members of the legal industry, recognizing that there may be some negative data that just anecdotally looking around, we knew that women were not as represented as men in some of the upper levels of the legal careers. We wanted to provide some really practical tools. I think it's our experience that so many firms and organizations are committed to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we don't have the toolkit yet to really advance those. And so we wanted to contribute to the legal community by providing some advice and guidance on best practices. So we asked Dr. Glass and her team to provide some of that. And this is kind of the next wave of the initiative. We're going to spend the next couple of years really trying to implement and provide additional information about best practices for removing some of the barriers I just summarized. So the first is focusing on recruiting. As you saw the numbers, even from law school, the difference between law school and women attorneys, there's a decrease, and then those numbers drop as you move up the career ladder. So it's really critically important that law firms and organizations that hire attorneys have inclusive recruitment and hiring practices. So that includes advertising widely, targeting recruitment efforts. So actually going out and recruiting from organizations where there is a high representation of women. It's also important that inclusive and recruitment practice avoids hiring from your own network. Our networks, we're somewhat tribal and tend to sometimes reflect people who are like us. And when we only pull from our network and recruit in that way and don't look to other networks and other resources, we miss out on an opportunity to increase the diversity of our recruitment pool. And then in addition to that, in the hiring and recruiting talent, it's critically important that you have formal, objective, and transparent hiring procedures. This is important for the theme that I just discussed, that often without that, we tend to go with the status quo or go with our gut, which is a way for implicit bias and some of these biases to creep in and prevents us from, I think, expanding the talent that we're bringing into our organizations. Some really concrete ways of implementing these formal and objective transparent hiring procedures are introducing blind evaluations, I'm sure many of you have heard about the studies that when resumes include gendered information, even if that's just the name, the outcomes for whether that resume moves forward in the hiring process are incredibly different than if that information is removed. So there's, as we're reviewing resumes, even when it's unintentional, when there's gender, identifying information included, that tends to have an impact and reduce, frankly, the diversity inclusiveness of our hiring process. So removing that, whether it's just through redaction and reviewing resumes without that information, is one way to a very formal and concrete way to improve your hiring procedures. But there are other approaches too. You want to make sure that your hiring procedures are formal, that you have a very concrete set of evaluation factors, and that you're true, your search committees are true to those, and scoring candidates across the same requirements and expectations. And then once you recruit, the next step, and I think this is a really critical piece, is retention. Once we recruit a diverse workforce, it's so incredibly important that we retain the diversity. That's important, because this creates that pipeline of talented leaders over time. If you are able to maintain women attorneys, or women in whichever career path you may be in, at that entry level, it creates more opportunity for our organizations to move people up the pipeline. But when we're drawing from that diverse base of employees. It's also to the benefit of our organizations. Organizations with women and people of color in leadership are stronger and more effective. Part of that is because of the diverse perspectives that would be reflected in decision making. A diverse group of decision makers is also, it also kind of becomes circular, because when you have a diverse group of decision makers, you're more likely to recruit, hire, and promote talented women and people of color. And finally, going back to we can only be what we see. Women in color in leadership serve as visible examples. They serve as that role model that messages out to the general community, but also your recruiting base, that this is an organization that supports and enables the careers of everyone. So some a couple of other do's and don'ts. Again, sponsoring and mentoring women, making sure that women who are in the career track are provided with mentorship that helps them develop those critical intangible skills that are important for leadership. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, I'm losing track of time, was Equal Pay Day. The importance of fair compensation cannot be understated. So developing procedures that are transparent and ensure fair compensation are incredibly important for retaining women and making sure that they remain optimistic about their opportunities for promotion. And then it's important that we don't accept tokenism. One danger that I think some organizations fall into is, once you've recruited a diverse pool or diverse workforce, accepting that because you've added one person of a certain, stat or identity, that the work is done, that you've succeeded. This is an ongoing thing, and it's something that I think organizations, the importance of diversity and equity is something that has to be built into the value system, rather than a goal that's achieved and then moved on, forgotten and moved as you move on to other goals. And then I think, the think manager, think male, it's just important that we avoid stereotypes. And this goes back to that tightrope and the agency penalties, that we don't make assumptions about certain skill set or personality traits or leadership qualities based on somebody's identity. And then, so those are the best practices for organizations. This work is also really important on an individual level. I think it's up to all of us to gain awareness of our bias, becoming more aware of the ways in which gender and racial bias shape our views, assumptions, and stereotypes. There's some great tools out there, and I'd be happy to direct people to some of those formal tools where you can evaluate your own bias, and that's always illuminating. I think all of us think of ourselves as unbiased, but some of these tools and these surveys are really illuminating to see where we may have some implicit bias. And there are other ways of doing that as well. The second piece is just building relationships with your women and minority colleagues, just listening and becoming an ally. I think learning more about the experience of women and minorities in the workplace is incredibly illuminating, and I think really helps develop some of these diversity policies and practices that will benefit your organization over time. That's certainly something we, I think, gained in the 2020 study, was collecting that qualitative data, the interviews, and hearing the stories and hearing in women's words what it meant to experience harassment in the workplace and how that impacted them personally, how it impacted their families. Listening and learning from that is incredibly valuable, and I think has important benefits, and really, I think, helps motivate people for change, but also helps remove some biases and expands just the perspective of what barriers there may be. And then the last, along the lines, as you're listening and asking these questions, it's just incredibly important that when colleagues share their experience of bias, they're believed, and it's their experiences are not minimized or dismissed as like, that's just your experience, or that's just your perception of that situation. One of the challenges is if you're an individual that hasn't experienced a certain bias, it's hard, some people may dismiss or minimize that experience that they're hearing just because it's something they haven't experienced themselves. So, this is certainly a situation where start by believing and hearing people is the first step to gaining awareness of bias. Once we gain that awareness, the second step is just engaging productively to minimize bias. So again, I've mentioned supporting inclusive policies, whether that's changing your search and hiring practices, adopting flexible workplaces and parental supports within your organization. Supporting these are important ways of minimizing bias and interrupting the barriers to advancement. The second is mentoring and sponsoring talented colleagues. I think that's a concept we're all really familiar with. And then finally, seeking partnerships, looking for ways to work together. And I want to thank the Chamber for the opportunity to present. I think this is a perfect example of seeking partnerships and working together to advance, our organizations across the state, and looking for ways where we can work together and not duplicate efforts. And that's something I think we've been doing across the board, and an area where we can continue to improve and find more ways to work together to address these issues. The final example is just intervening productively to interrupt bias. I won't go through this example, but sometimes one of the ways that's really helpful is to actually go through some examples and kind of talk through. And I think I would encourage you to engage in some of these exercises in your own work, your own organizations, of doing some kind of case studies where you're given an example and talk about ways to interrupt that bias. So this slide includes an example. There's a number of these examples in our study. And again, thanks to Nate for linking that. So if any of you want to look at that, there's a number of examples and exercises of bias interruption. So I encourage all of you to look at those and practice. So that's in a nutshell, the 2020 study. I want to encourage any of you who are interested to look at the 2020 study. I have done my best to cover it at a very high level, but it's a rich resource with a lot of really helpful data. And I think as I mentioned, Women Lawyers of Utah will be working over the next couple of years to, one, get the word out about the study, but also build partnerships and look for ways to implement some of these best practices. And then finally, it's important to note that the 2020 study did not happen without incredible support from our sponsors, many of which are members of the Chamber. So those include the firms listed here. So we want to thank them for their support of the 2020 study and the work of the women lawyers on the initiative for the advancement of women in the law.
Mica, thank you so much. That is a lot of information, and I would, as you encourage folks to actually refer to the study and take a look at the information provided there. Not only are the findings, but the recommendations are really, really remarkable and helpful in many ways to go forward. I want to just start by asking you guys just kind of a general question as we go over this data. It's helpful data, but much of it is rather discouraging. And I don't want to start out on a dour note, but I'm going to start out on a dour note. And maybe I'll direct this to you first, Ashley. What did you find most discouraging from this report?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jacey, for having me on the panel and to talk about this important issue. Agree, it's totally depressing. As Mica knows, I was not optimistic about seeing huge improvement, but I did not expect the results that we ultimately got. I think the bias reports and which are critical issues that were identified were not as much a surprise to me, because I think they're pretty commonly things that professional women experience. The one that was sort of a gut punch, frankly, was the harassment. And I expected to see the reports on harassment, as Mica noted. There's probably an aspect to that is derived from greater awareness. But at any event, I would have hoped that we were in better shape on that statistic at this point. The other one that's really disheartening to me as an equity partner in a law firm is the numbers and how we haven't made any improvement on those in the last 10 years. But I liked Mica's slide on the suggestions that were made by the interviewees, because I think there are good things on that front that are going on, and I think we'll see more progress in the next 5 to 10 years on those, even though the results of this survey were fairly depressing.
Thank you, Ashley. Nate, I want to ask the same question to you. What having worked in this 10 years ago, what struck you the most and kind of I thought we'd be better at this point?
I'm going to agree with Ashley on your gut punch. I mean, I'm embarrassed. It's shocking. It's wrong. This is the legal profession. I mean, we've been through 3 years of law school. I mean, what is happening? This is really concerning that level, 61, 62% level of, workplace violations. I mean, I don't even know what to say. So I wrote that down. I agree with you. Can I just give you my other ones as well? Number one, we are always behind the nation. I don't understand this. I mean, Utah is just this outlier that we are really struggling. Our numbers are behind the nation, 10 percentage points, 13, 14 percentage points. We're always behind. Our numbers are not increasing in the practice. And I thought that they were. People were encouraging me, saying, we're getting more and more numbers in the bar. We're doing better. The numbers are changing. But in the end, they're not changing much. And for years, I've been talking about this 80-20, 71, kind of 19. We've got to get better numbers than these numbers. 23% is just not the number that we want here. So for the number of people going to law school, 50-50s, I talked to someone today who said their law school is 55% women. It's like, Utah is behind the nation here, and I don't understand it. So, 60% of our bar comes from those two law schools, and then 40% from elsewhere. But so the other thing that shocked me, here's another one, but 61% of people reported that in their workplace, there were no women in senior roles. I don't even know how to, I was hired by a person, I'm a woman at my law firm, managed by, women in our law firm. It's like, this is such a foreign concept for me. I don't know what these situations are like, where they are, but this is a very concerning number. 61%. That's legal, legal departments, law firms, legal agencies. We need women in roles. 61% is unacceptable. I just don't even know what to say about that. To me, the big issue is always compensation. I don't think that we've cracked any new numbers here. There's been some increases, but not in comparison. The numbers, it's a gender equity issue, and we're not making progress, in my opinion, on the gender equity number. So I'll stop at that, but I have several other things that I've written down as very disturbing, and we have a lot of work to do.
Nate, Mica, I want to ask you the same question. Having spent so much time with this, what was the most disappointing to you?
I think for me, I echo what everyone else has said, but it was shocking to me that we had not moved the dial at all in terms of representation. So 10 years is a lot of time. And when I saw the percentage of women that are the percentage of partners that are women remained exactly the same. That was a gut punch to me, because, I I guess I think a lot of us would perceive over time, while, you know, there have been challenges, and I think the data about harassment and workplace experience are really illuminating. I personally expected to see a little bit of a pump, a little bit of change and improvement in terms of representation. So that's a really sobering statistic, and something I think is urgent. We've got to change that. And if we don't change representation at the leadership ranks, we're not going to be able to address, you know, representation and diversity and equity and inclusion efforts across organizations. We've really got to work on leadership. So.
Thank you. One of the things that I found just most important, or I guess most striking from the report, and the way that the methodology behind the report, was the fact that this was done anonymously, right? This was through anonymous surveys. And I think we found that people were willing to talk about their experiences because it was anonymous. And I will say, even in putting together this presentation and working on this presentation, it became quite apparent that while people experienced these things and they were willing to talk about them informally or off the record, when it came to actually sharing them with their employers or in a way that could be associated with their company, in non-law firm environments, or associated again with particular employers, they were much less willing to talk about that. I think the findings address that, and some of the recommendations address that, but I want to open that up to this group. I think, again, the findings found that people are more aware of maybe when things are not exactly right, but are not always still willing to talk about it in a way that could move the needle. I just want to open that up to this panel's suggestions. Ashley, can start with you.
Yeah, and I think some of the harder things to get. I like Nate. I don't know what to say about the harassment. But I think on the bias issues in the workplace, and this spans not just to law firms, but all workplaces in Utah, those are I find the hardest things to address, because they're not obvious, they're insidious, they're experiences that build up over the course of a career. I think it was the ABA study, or a headline associated with the ABA study, that referenced this as a death by 1,000 cuts, where women experience these biases over time. And maybe it's, you know, something like being mistaken for staff when you go to court, which has happened to me and almost all of my women colleagues several times in our career. Being talked down to in a meeting, being asked to get coffee for a client, you know, just stuff like that seems like a little thing, but over the course of your career, constantly having to experience those, they add up, and they send a clear message to women that they don't belong. And I think this is a career, as a lot of careers, that really takes grit. You know, you're going to have hard times, and you're going to have to work through it. And if you have examples of people that are in leadership positions, it's easier to work through that, because you can go talk to somebody who's been through that. If you have no one, like 61% of the employers here, or 61% of the respondents, that's when I think you start to think about, well, maybe I don't belong and I should leave. And I think that's what we have happen in Utah, is more and more of that. And I think the issue for me that I think is most important is cultural change, and secondarily representation. And I think it's a chicken and egg problem, where I think if we have more women, and I see this in my own firm, in leadership positions, in equity partnerships, for instance, in a law firm structure, that's where with male allies, we see change, because we are deliberate about it. And you can't just have a diversity policy and not implement it and assume things are going to be okay, and that things are okay because we have a diversity committee or we have a diversity policy. You have to be very concerted and very deliberate about addressing these issues, and it takes time. And I think over time, you see that cultural change, and over time, you see that representation, and they all kind of go in tandem. And I think that's happening on a lot of fronts in my own firm and in other firms in town, and that's not reflected in the survey data. But that's where I am optimistic, is just seeing more and more of that, and I hope to see more of that in the next 10 years.
Mica, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing to add on that, I think it's so important that it's not just women that are it's not the responsibility of only women to identify these issues, to
Right.
identify bias and harassment. You know, just speaking to my own personal experience, I felt, you know, it's easier to talk about experiences when other people recognize them. I was fortunate to work with some great colleagues, and I was on a call once and definitely experiencing some of these biases. And the partner I was working with called it out and, you know, said, look, I want you to know I saw what just happened and it's not okay. And that certainly opened the door for me to say, oh yeah, well, that happens every time I talk to this person, or that happens in these circumstances, and really opens the door for dialogue. So I think it's so important that it's not left to just women and women of color to identify these experiences. It's something we all have to recognize and call it out when we see it.
Nate, do you want to speak to that?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say that I think the 2020 report is required reading for all lawyers. And what's unique about this report is not every state is doing this. Utah is really to be commended. The women lawyers of Utah really to be appreciated, commended, and supported and championed here, because what they're doing is really, really important. I'm happy and proud to be a part of it. But we need to get this in the hands and before the eyes of everyone who can and should be a part of this solution. I mean, we're 10 years in on this, you know, 2 studies, and we need to make changes now. And so I agree, Ashley, cultural change, yes. You know, allies, you know, sponsors, champions, everything, yes. But we need to make changes this year. And I don't know how to say it otherwise, that the legal profession, you know, in Utah, throughout the nation, wherever, you know, we can't stand for these problems to linger and to not move or change. We have to change them now. So I want lawyers to take accountability and be responsible for microaggressions, for reframing all of their education and their traditions and things like that. You know, this is the way we do things. I mean, it's time to reframe and start over on a lot of what we do. I also recognize that we have kind of a cultural issue in the sense we have kind of an urban core in Utah and a rural setting, and I'm not going to give anybody a pass on this thing. You know, it's a Logan to St. George, you know, Vernal to Wendover issue. We've got to, everywhere we go, I mean, we should do better and be better.
So thank you all for those observations. As this is the Salt Lake Chamber, we have, as Mica mentioned, right, many of the sponsors of this report are chamber members. We applaud law firms for taking this kind of deep dive and recognize that some of these factors are unique to law firm environments and the way that those are structured, but they're not contained to law firms. These types of biases, these types of issues and structures are not unique to law firms. They're not unique to lawyers. They cross industry sectors. They cross every type of corporation and business, large and small. So from our panels, and many of you have spent your careers advising different types of businesses as clients. We all know that a business is a business, right? A structure is a structure. What would be some of your takeaways from this report that people should say, that's great, so glad the women lawyers of Utah are looking at that horrible practice of law. That's not us. What should other businesses be taking away from this report as they address these issues on their own? Mica, I'm going to start with you on that one.
I think one thing to take away from this report, well, one thing to do is you can compare the data, you know, looking at our 2020 study, looking to the Women in the Workplace study from McKinsey and CohenLehman.org. There are a lot of parallels. The data is not different in other workplaces. So I think it's important to not look at this study and think that this is something unique to the legal industry. And a lot of these issues related to bias and harassment, they cut across the board. You know, looking in higher education, there's this really excellent study by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine on the impact of harassment and the impact that has on organizations and the cost of the loss of that talent. So I think it's just important. You know, as you look at the study and look at how this compares, when we have a leak in the pipeline, those are lost resources, and that has a, you know, a very negative impact on your organization.
Thanks, Mica. Ashley?
Yeah, I think pretty much all the findings, and there are some unique things with law firms and law, but the bias findings are particularly relevant to really any women professional or business that is looking to advance women. I think it's not just women lawyers that face this tightrope bias, right? And I think that's one that resonates with me a lot, and with a lot of my colleagues, where you don't want to be too aggressive because that's not ladylike, but in order to get ahead and to be successful in your career, and frankly, as a lawyer, to advocate for your client, you need to be assertive, aggressive, confident, and you need to project confidence. But for women, it's like, okay, do that, but not too much, because then that's not acceptable. So that's where cultural change is hard. But I think the more women that are out there and are ignoring that, I mean, within bounds of professionalism, right? But you can't get all tied up in that and worry too much about that tightrope, because we'll never change anything, right? We have to have examples of women who are out there doing that, so that becomes more normal. But I think Nate is right. Cultural change takes time, but I think awareness is just as important, and can, on a personal level and on a business by business level, have an effect, a real effect. Like Mica said, in her personal life, where you see, as a woman, women see these things. They see the bias in the workplace. They see the tightrope bias, the agency bias. But we've had a lot of men, male lawyers and otherwise, read this report and weigh in and say, look, I never thought about that. I never thought about these little things that are actually much more important than I ever thought, and calling out that bias, so that once you know it, you see it, and then male advocates in the workplace can point that out and see it too, and it becomes less confrontational. It's just a matter of awareness and things that people will avoid doing themselves once you identify it and you see it and you see the effect it has on a professional woman or woman in the workplace. So.
Great. Nate.
Yeah, I'll say that, the real positive thing about this report is that it's here, it's in your hands, you can read it and you can benefit from it. Just think about having someone come to your organization, your business, your structure, and say, here, I'm going to do all these wonderful things to assess where you're at. Well, read the report and assess for yourself, and then learn the lingo, the microaggressions, the prove it again bias, the tightrope bias, agency penalties, the motherhood penalties, lack of fit bias, the compensation bias. I mean, start plugging these into your organization and saying, hey, this is my consultant telling me I need to check these things. Do it for yourself. Recruitment bias, retention bias. Are you doing blind reviews? Here's your blueprint. Here's your template to improve your organization, because it is 2021 and we don't want to carry into the next century here the problems that we've had for centuries, right? So let's fix things, make you better, make you more efficient, make you more productive, more profitable, and a better organization across the board, because your leadership's better, your recruitment's better, your retention's better. And I do believe that change can occur in these organizations. Let's hold up the organizations and champion those who are doing this the right way, and let's encourage everyone else to come along as well. And then business organizations hire lawyers, and you can say to these lawyers, hey, how are you doing at your firm? Because we're doing really well. We're really trying to have DE&I, and are you doing DE&I? Because we're doing DE&I. I mean, people say that to me, and I'm proud to say, yeah, we're working hard on it too. So we're together in this. So change is good.
So I want us to keep on that note, as organizations are, and this year there's been so much discussion about these types of issues and what businesses need to do to improve. Lots of discussion around the business case for inclusion, right? Of both women and minorities, how that improves a business on many levels. I want us to end on some kind of an optimistic note, right? I mean, again, this is some pretty discouraging information, but I think the fact that you have some very concrete examples here, as Nate said, right? Everyone should read this report. I think reading the quotes and the firsthand experiences help provide that framework for, oh, that's what you mean, right? That's what that looks like. It can help those who have not experienced that type of bias become more aware of it. And again, they're the types of experiences that people aren't probably willing to talk about in open company. And so providing those examples is very helpful. Just kind of as a last question, I want to go to each of you. What do you take away as a positive from this report? What kind of optimistic thing can we take away from this, or can we build to hopefully see some real progress? Nate, I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to start with you on this one. Sorry.
I think it's absolutely fantastic that we're having this discussion. The reason why we're having this discussion is great leaders years ago, 2007, 2008, 2009, I saw this develop in that time frame. And we got into it. It was expensive. We raised money. We did all this, and there we got it done. And now we are 10 years later at the next report. We're having this discussion. Not every state is having this discussion. The positive thing for me is that Utah is going to solve some of these problems because, one, we want to, we need to, we have to, but other states may not be tackling them like we are. I'm proud of the leaders of the women lawyers of Utah and other people who are in this to fix this and solve this problem. So for me, the positive is, I'm not going to say we're ahead or behind or wherever we are, but we're in this. And I in the email to the panel today, I said, well, we clearly have to do it 2030 because I want to see progress in 2030. And maybe by 2025 we're feeling better, but I want to see progress now because this report is so compelling. Everybody needs to read this. Every CEO in Utah needs to read this and say, for his or her organization, where are we? And I'm talking law firms and everybody else. So this is an incredible blueprint to assess where you are, where we are as a society, and what we can do to fix things. So for me, the fact that we're here having this discussion is so great.
Thanks, Nate. Ashley?
I think I am optimistic, notwithstanding the results of this. I'm optimistic because I see cultural change, and I see it from my clients, and I see it from my firm and my peer firms. As Nate alluded to, I do national work for large Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies. I don't get to do work for them at this point unless we respond to a diversity survey. And that's been around for a while, right? We've had the diversity and inclusion question from clients for a while, but clients have gotten much more aggressive and much more deliberate about it, such that they're not only having us fill out these robust surveys about our practices and our numbers and how we staff cases, how we advance women, how we advance minority attorneys, but they are following up on it and making sure we continue to implement what we said we were going to implement. And if we don't, the money where the mouth is, they will take us off of their list. So this is a cultural value for our firm. It has been since our inception, but it's also a business imperative at this point. And I think the corporations out there know that, and they know they can drive change. And I think the same thing can happen here in Utah. And I'm just optimistic to see that change happen.
Thank you, Ashley. Mike, I want to give you the last word on this. What are those optimistic takeaways? What do you see happening as a result of it?
Well, it's always hard to go last because I echo the comments of both Nate and Ashley. I think they've really highlighted the positives here and things to be optimistic about. So I apologize for re-echoing those, but I do think the positive is we're having these conversations. We, there's an interest within the legal community. I want to highlight there's an interest within organizations. We often have talked, at the individual level, I think we have work to do in terms of, I don't know that this is the water cooler talk at every law firm. So that's where we want to get, that's where we'd like to arrive. But right now it's, I think there's been a lot of opportunities for partnerships. The Utah Center for Legal Inclusion, exists and is working on this. The Minority Bar Association is working on this. And so we're seeing a lot of opportunities for collaboration and building partnerships. It's, really encouraging to have you invite us here to speak about it, that the Salt Lake Chamber is interested in this. So I think that's, a real point of optimism that there's these opportunities for partnership and shared work and carrying what I think the report shows is a really heavy load. It's a really heavy load to move this forward, but having being able to collaborate with others on finding solutions is encouraging.
Well, I want to thank each of you. it's just such fantastic experience and observations, expertise that you would take the time to share that with us. I'm very grateful for that. I want to thank the Women Lawyers of Utah for dedicating the resources and the time and the expertise to developing such an impressive report and being willing to share it with us. We have provided the link to that. We will make this webinar as well as Mica's presentation and the report available on our website. And I will offer for the Women Lawyers of Utah as well as the Chamber that this is something that they're happy to come and talk to your organizations about and to help, but this is intended to be a tool with some sobering information, but that can hopefully help us make some real progress. So thank you to each of you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you later. Thank you.